Hello everyone, I'm really excited to introduce our live webinar today, A Payment Revolution, where Luke and I will endeavor to answer the question, what is next for Buy Now, Pay Later? My name is Ashraf Shanab and I'm the EMEA Commercial Director here at RFi Group. Before we get started, I would like to tell you a little bit more about RFi. I appreciate that some of you might be familiar with us, but for those who are not, RFi Group, at RFi Group, we specialize in financial services. We work closely with some of the world's leading financial service providers, covering a wide range of topics, rolling out to date 110 programs across 48 markets, where we speak to 500,000 consumers, 100,000 businesses, and 20,000 merchants globally every year. We ask them everything about their usage and attitudes and future intentions towards banking and wealth and payment. And through these studies and based on our partners' strategic and business priorities, we provide with actionable recommendations to support with business decisions. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, Luke Allchin, please remember, whilst Luke and I will try to provide with an informative session, we are really looking forward to your questions. So let this be an interactive session. Please remember to post your questions in the chat box in your control panel. For those who are joining us now, welcome. Luke Allchin, our Research Director, will be kicking off in just a minute. He'll run through the agenda of the session and walk you through the latest insights from our Buy Now, Pay Later study. I'll be seeing you shortly, but for now, I'd like to hand you over to Luke.
Excellent, thank you, Ash, and welcome everyone to today's session. So the focus for today's session is, for the next 25 or so minutes, I'm going to walk you through a few of my thoughts, as well as some of the latest findings from RFi's research around Buy Now, Pay Later market here in the UK. So some of the sort of key areas that we'll be discussing, or I'll be discussing in the coming slides, we'll be looking a little bit around the sort of awareness, as well as the usage of these Buy Now, Pay Later services, as well as the perception of Buy Now, Pay Later and what is specifically driving its adoption and usage of Buy Now, Pay Later, as well as the ways in which Buy Now, Pay Later is influencing consumer behaviour. So not just around the ways in which they make payments, but also the way in which they shop, both online and in store. And then finally, we're looking at some of the sort of challenges, as well as some of those opportunities which lie ahead for Buy Now, Pay Later. So to kick things off, we're looking at a little bit around sort of the awareness as well as usage of Buy Now, Pay Later. So Buy Now, Pay Later has been in the UK market now for a number of years. Taking Klarna as an example, it launched here in the UK back in 2014. However, it's really been sort of past 24 or so months that we've seen this sort of widespread adoption and uptake amongst the UK consumers, with now over 2/3 of UK consumers either aware of Buy Now, Pay Later providers, and with around 1 in 4 saying that have used such a service. So this slide here as well, we've sort of drawn a sort of bit of comparison to Australia. So Australia is arguably one of the most mature Buy Now, Pay Later markets currently in the world, although we are beginning to see the UK rivaling Australia for this. Buy Now, Pay Later is becoming a major force within the payments, within the world of payments, especially here in the UK. So in terms of how both awareness and usage have changed over the past 12 months, over the past year, we can see that it's actually really, among those consumers who are aged 25 to 34, is where we're seeing the greatest increase of both awareness and usage. However, both awareness and usage has actually increased across most of these age groups here in the UK. So it's shown it's not just those young consumers who are driving that upward trend. So I think one thing that's the driver behind this is initially we saw that purchases were sort of very heavily skewed towards online fashion, which was more geared towards the female audience. However, now we're seeing more Buy Now, Pay Later brands are beginning to expand their reaches into other areas of retail, and both broadening that range of services and retailers and products that they offer, which in turn is becoming more relevant to a wider range of consumers. So this next slide here, we can see here about some of the types of services and products and retailers that buy now, pay later are beginning to sort of partner with. So as you can see, it's beginning to be offered to a wider range of goods and services. And as I just said, buy now, pay later is rapidly becoming more relevant to more consumers, which is, I think, partly why we're seeing this uplift in usage, particularly among some of those older consumer groups. So the buy now, pay later scene is largely dominated by these four players, or at least in the UK market. We have PayPal Credit as being the larger of those four, although both Klarna and ClearPay are gaining the most traction, while we see here that the PayPal Credit is almost sort of plateaued and almost on a sort of a downward trend. And this again is then also reflected in terms of the current usage of these brands. So whereas that was previously awareness, this is usage. We're seeing that Klarna is quickly closing that gap on the PayPal Credit. So, talking around the sort of subject a little bit, some of the data we have at our RFi group around digital banking, so from our global digital banking studies, it shows that PayPal actually performs quite strongly for consumer trust, and it's trailing just behind some of the incumbent banks for that level of trust. Whereas some of the new and emerging fintechs, as well as some of those alternative payment providers, are actually scoring much lower. So naturally, sort of these buy now, pay later brands, as and when they begin to establish themselves more within the market and grow that brand awareness, we are likely to see that advantage that PayPal has over these brands will begin to fade away. And I think that's partly what we're sort of seeing here, as usage of PayPal is beginning to dip, while both Klarna and some of the other buy now, pay later services are on the rise. So moving on now a little bit to talk around some of the perceptions of buy now, pay later services and some of the reasons why consumers might be using them. So while some people I think may try to tell you that buy now, pay later is being used by sort of non-credit worthy consumers and those who are unable to access credit cards, this is not something that we are seeing within our data. It's not really one of those key drivers for people to use buy now, pay later services. So our data actually shows that many of the consumers who are using buy now, pay later services already hold a credit card product and are choosing to pay via buy now, pay later services as an alternate payment method. So consumers' perception of buy now, pay later is generally speaking all very positive. One of the key differentiators or differences between buy now, pay later perception and credit card perception is that it's cost. So consumers have this perception that buy now, pay later is a lower cost option, as well as they see it as being more relevant to someone like them, as well as being easier to understand. I think it's also very worth just drawing your attention to the data on the far right side of that chart there as well around rewards. So this is currently, as it stands, this is the one area where credit card still has that edge over the buy now, pay later services, and we'll discuss a little bit more later on in the presentation. So another sort of key driver for buy now, pay later adoption is its clever marketing strategy of some of those main buy now, pay later brands in the market. So positioning those key marketing messages at that point of sale and during a checkout, I think has worked really well for these brands. The table there on the right side shows that there's around 27% of consumers who chose to pay via buy now, pay later. So they saw this option to pay while at the checkout, and then they decided to give it a try, which is interesting. I say, in terms of looking at some of the other sort of key drivers of usage for buy now, pay later, we see that the fact that convenience and ease of applying is some of the main reasons there why people are choosing these services. Again, we've already spoken around sort of the idea of it being quick and easy to apply as being appealing and important to buy now, pay later. But we also see consumers also find or believe the ability to be able to track or better track their purchases, their spending, and manage their repayments as being, you know, an appealing sort of feature for buy now, pay later. In addition to that, we've also highlighted on this slide again that sort of the ability to redeem reward points or have some sort of loyalty points or some reward scheme built into it. So consumer appeal for this is quite strongly, and as I said, as it stands, this is that one sort of standout factor that the credit cards have over the buy now, pay later. So in terms of how buy now, pay later has influenced some of the consumer behaviour, so from this chart here, we can see that around a quarter of buy now, pay later users will use these services whenever they're available to them. So this just illustrates that hold that that buy now, pay later has on quite a sizable chunk of the market. However, more interestingly though, we see that these services aren't just changing the way in which consumers are paying for products or making these purchases, but it's also impacting the way in which they are shopping. So we can see here on the sort of the blue bar that around 15% of buy now, pay later users are saying that they are, you know, their choice of where they shop is actually being determined by the availability of buy now, pay later, with 15% saying that they only go to online or in-person stores once they know that the buy now, pay later option is available. And again, this is something I think will be really, really interesting to see trended over time and see, just watch that segment there grow. So in addition to this as well, so consumers, you know, also feel that the buy now, pay later gives them more control over the spending and helps them budget. And again, this is also another sort of key differentiator between buy now, pay later and the credit cards as well, is that ability to just have better managing, have a better vision and sight of what purchases they're making and how much they still owe. Other ways that buy now, pay later impacts consumer behaviour is around spend frequency as well as that purchase value. So there's a sizable chunk of the buy now, pay later market, or these individuals who are using buy now, pay later, admitting that they've made purchases that they would have otherwise not made. So not only are they making more purchases or purchasing more frequently, but they also admit to having spent, you know, more money or made a slightly larger purchase. Which again, while this does highlight, you know, a clear opportunity for retailers deciding to partner with buy now, pay later services or brands who essentially will see an increased basket value as well as a lower checkout abandonment. For some, they believe, you know, for many as well, they see this, that this could be a possible, could be putting certain or more vulnerable consumers at risk. So looking at the same piece of data now, but looking at by different age groups, we actually see that it's among those older consumers, those who are age 65 plus, who are the ones who are more likely to feel that the buy now, pay later services are allowing them to have better control of their spending. While it is the younger consumers, so the millennials and the Gen Zs, who feel as if it is, you know, impacting the amount of money they're spending. So some of the verbatims here are, you know, a great way that gives us some great insights and really illustrates the thought process of some of these consumers. So some of the things that I've mentioned here is the idea that they may buy a better brand, or it's some of them mentioned that it gives them the freedom to buy items that exceed the amount they currently have available, and as well they don't feel as restrained by a specific budget. They also mention about the idea of being able to spread the cost over a period of time and then be able to save up the money in the meantime. So interestingly as well, so there has been several sort of psychological studies conducted around making large ticket purchases as well as the buy now, pay later services. And it was actually found that spending money sort of triggers the same sort of region in the mind as sort of pain and disgust. But more interestingly though is the idea that when paying for something by buy now, pay later, this kind of bypasses that feeling. So consumers are able to, and that's why it's so popular as well, is consumers are still able to get the benefit and the reward of buying and making a purchase without the guilt of having to pay for it there and then. So the last section here is just looking a little bit around some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities for buy now, pay later. So when we look at these levels of satisfaction among those who are using the buy now, pay later services, we see that 9 in 10 of these users say they are either satisfied or very satisfied with the service they've received. And so I think one of the sort of the key indicators for longevity of buy now, pay later usage is likely to be the overall customer satisfaction or the overall customer experience. And when you're seeing that 9 in 10 of the users are either satisfied or very satisfied with that service, you know, it's hard to argue that you know, buy now, pay later isn't here to stay. With that being said, though, however, there are still a few ways that buy now, pay later brands could further improve their customer experience. So regardless of age, we see that the barriers to usage remains mostly the same. So the most significant one here on that first column on the left there, we see that it relates to in-store purchases. So some consumers still see that when making purchases in store, credit cards is seen as being the easier and quicker option still. Also, sometimes users find it difficult to find the correct store within their app, and they've also noted the lack of staff being available. You know, when they try to find help when trying to complete a purchase. So this next slide here looks at some of the drivers behind satisfaction. So essentially, we're looking at a range of different attributes and features of the buy now, pay later and try and correlate them to the overall levels of satisfaction. And from which we can identify which are the more important attributes which will be driving this overall satisfaction score. So while simplicity of usage and repayment structure are coming out on top, consumers are generally quite satisfied with this. However, in the orange there, where we've highlighted here around the idea of making these in-store, in-person purchases, this is a bit of a pain point for the market. So as you can imagine, as lockdown begins to ease across the UK and summer weather descends upon us, I'm sure we'll see a number of shoppers flood the high streets, and this will present a greater opportunity for buy now, pay later brands to expand further into that sort of in-person, in-store market. So while several buy now, pay later brands are beginning to expand into these in-store payments, there are still a few where we see it as being a bit of a pain point. And again, in this market here, we can still see it as being a pain point. But again, yeah, it's not all doom and gloom for buy now, pay later. If anything, it just presents them and just illustrates that the wider opportunity that is available for them. And sort of finally, some of the other sort of challenges that I think buy now, pay later face, at least in the sort of bit more of a long term. Firstly, just being around regulatory intervention. So ultimately, the regulatory response to buy now, pay later will determine its future growth. So the FCA has already looked into buy now, pay later to be brought under its regulatory remit, and the FCA, in the FCA review of buy now, pay later, it made 20 or so recommendations and calls for urgent regulation for buy now, pay later. And this could see buy now, pay later brands needing to undertake affordability checks, which would greatly impact that sort of that customer experience as well as the availability of the buy now, pay later option. I think another threat that buy now, pay later faces is around its current funding model. So currently, sort of buy now, pay later provides, these buy now, pay later providers borrow short-term to fund the purchases made by its customers. And while currently in an ultra-low interest rate environment, this makes sense. But what will happen when the interest rates begin to rise? So buy now, pay later's perception or its perceived low cost, and this is a key driver of its usage over credit cards. Also, as we can expect to see increase in competition as well as the market matures, which will again put more pressure on these buy now, pay later providers to potentially offer rewards, which again is further adding challenge to its current buy now, pay later model. So, I think one of the possibly the way in which I see it, I think we may eventually see some of these buy now, pay later brands begin to apply for banking licenses, which essentially would allow them to fund internally and and avoid this potential threat. So just sort of maybe just a little summary here, just to sort of cover off some of the points I've just made in the last 15 or so slides. So generally speaking, we see that awareness and usage of buy now, pay later continues to grow here in the UK, and this is partly because of the broadening range of these retailers joining the party, basically. Overall, the customer experience of buy now, pay later suggests data is here to stay. So we saw that 9 in 10 consumers are satisfied or very satisfied with the service. So that's I think is a sign that it has longevity. So this is particularly if buy now, pay later providers address the customer pain point of making those in-store purchases. The opportunity of retailers partnering with buy now, pay later providers is clear. Not only does it increase that average basket value, but it also lowers checkout abandonment. However, some believe that this can put vulnerable customers more at risk, which is why we're expected to see some sort of some regulation coming into place in the coming months or coming year. The regulatory response to buy now, pay later will certainly determine the market's future growth. And sort of the last point I just want to make here is around sort of rewards. So obviously, rewards is currently a key area where credit cards have that edge over buy now, pay later. However, as competition grows within the buy now, pay later space, we're likely to see maybe loyalty points and rewards being introduced by the buy now, pay later brands as a way to stand out in the ever-growing buy now, pay later crowd.
Thank you very much, Luke. Definitely very insightful presentation, and I'm really hoping that we can unpick this now in the Q&A session. I just want to remind everybody to post their question in the control panel. I will try to answer as many of those as possible. But whilst we're getting those questions, Luke, I'm hoping to go to revisit some of the points that you presented us with today, and maybe kind of unpick those with you. I think one of the things I really wanted to address, maybe look at with you, is there is certainly in the conversations that we're having, whether it's a buy now, pay later provider or a card scheme or financial service, an incumbent bank, there's a lot of questions around the future of buy now, pay later and the impact this would have on other predominant credit products. I mean, to put it bluntly, credit cards. I think my question to you is, do you foresee that buy now, pay later replacing those products to some degree, or having an impact on those, at least in the retail?
Yeah. So I think in the short term, I think, as I've said, I think buy now, pay later is here to stay. It'd be hard to argue it's not. While I could see among some of the older or middle-aged sort of consumers it being used in addition to their credit card products, what we're actually seeing among some of the younger consumers, so some of those sort of Gen Z or the young millennials, they're less likely to, or they're showing intent or less intent to take up credit cards. And I think one of the ways in which to look at this is that when we investigate sort of product holdings and that sort of customer product journey, we see that credit cards is usually taken up a little bit later on in their lives. We know for a fact that when someone turns 16, 17, 18, they'll take out a current account, they'll have a saving account, whereas credit cards may come in the early 20s, 21, 22, when you eventually take up that first credit card product, at least here in the UK. Whereas I think buy now, pay later is much more relevant to some of the younger, those Gen Z, so someone who's 18, 19 years old, 20 years old, who don't currently have a credit card, have no intention of taking up a credit card. They're being introduced to buy now, pay later. And I think it's among those younger consumers who, if you're already comfortable and already using buy now, pay later for all your purchases, especially as buy now, pay later begin to expand across a broader range of retailers, why would they then go, okay, well, I'm now in addition to that need a credit card? They're already less likely to be than they were previously to take a credit card. But now with once they become comfortable with buy now pay later, I can see it's among those younger ones where, yeah, I think it's going to start to greatly impact future uptake of credit cards among those younger consumers.
Thank you, Luke. And speaking of younger consumers, I think I know that we haven't unfortunately been able to travel as much as we all would like to, but one of the questions that I'm asking myself quite often, and especially with the news around Amex now launching a buy now pay later product for consumers in the US to pay for travel. What are the opportunities? And obviously we know that this is an industry that there's high appetite for within the younger consumers. What are the opportunities that you see this presenting for buy now pay later? And is there, do you think we're going to, buy now pay later is going to comfortably break into the travel industry?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We already know it's quite common among a lot of people to have a saving account dedicated towards saving for their holiday. Like some people will already decide the year ahead that they will go on holiday in September, and they say they begin saving for it year on year. I think what buy now pay later would do, or what it enables, is people to possibly make a purchase, or purchase their flights, purchase their hotel payments further in advance, which essentially would allow them to maybe get a slightly better deal, or be able to lock in and secure that they're going to be able to go on holiday at a certain point. So yeah, I can definitely see, we're already seeing it branching out into a number of different retailers and different industries. But yeah, I certainly it will prove to be successful within that travel space. It still sort of makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It really struck me when you mentioned that one of the top drivers for the usage of buy now pay later is the ease of login, ease of application. I imagine this is a process that would be made slightly more complex by the regulation. I hope not. I'm wondering what you think the impact on buy now pay later would be as a result of those regulations.
Well, yes, certainly. As they will definitely have some sort of impact, or it could be quite a great impact on that service. Obviously, we've still more time to see what the outcome will be. But as mentioned, I say if the regulatory sort of changes mean that they have to then start doing some sort of credit-worthy check, then it will greatly impact that. Not just the experience, but also the availability of the buy now pay later service to a number of individuals. And because the ease of application, that ease of quickness and speed is a key differentiator between buy now pay later and credit cards, we may see it will impact adoption. It's still too early to tell whether it will completely offset it. It may just mean that in terms of the growth that we'll see will be much slower. I think it's still too early to say whether it will completely derail the buy now pay later as a service. But yeah, for sure, depending on what the outcome will be, if certain credit worthiness checks are put into place, credit checks are put into place, the impact on that customer experience and the ease and speed will be greatly impacted, and will have an impact on that the adoption of the service.
Thank you, Luke. Some of the questions that we're receiving are around the difference in interest rates. They're obviously, the question is, what about emerging markets? Interest rates are higher compared to UK and Europe. We see buy now pay later increasing in African and Asian. Will we see that this will increase in Africa and Asia? Is there an opportunity for buy now pay later in countries with low banking penetration, in your view?
So as a first point regarding these sort of interest rates, I think the way in which it's been addressed within some of the markets where interest rates are higher, obviously it's going to be more around, it's going to be the retailer who's going to be taking the hit in terms of that, the cost of that. And eventually there may be some cost involved for the consumer as well. But I feel yeah, it will ultimately result that the adoption or the growth within the market may be slower. In terms of the comment around sort of in markets where there's a smaller bank population, I think yeah, there's still a need for it. It's I think yeah, there's still opportunities there for that to grow. It's definitely allowing, you know, gives people the opportunities to take on that sort of some sort of form of credit, which they may not have otherwise been able to access. But again, there is still that the whole risk around, you know, credit worthiness as well. I think from the mind of the buy now pay later providers, you know, they may still be seen as there being a requirement is that someone has to have some sort of bank account in order to access it. But it's probably still, I'm sure, a number of these brands are already, you know, investigating and looking into that particular space as well.
Thank you, Luke. One of the questions we've got here is around the growth of buy now pay later in the retail sector, and I think the question is, what are the specific retail areas where we've seen buy now pay later growing significantly over the last 12 months? Yeah,
so as I said, I say I think the main space initially was around sort of online fashion, and it was a key area where it initially started. But I think the different kind of areas of retail that we've seen the biggest growth in the past 12 months, I think, has been around sort of the sort of technology, as well as some of these home appliances as well. So some of sort of the white goods like your fridge, freezers, or sort of cookers and stuff like that. And I think that itself, I think, is why we're seeing the growth among some of the older age groups, some of those who may be, you know, buying, you know, having their first home or moving home and stuff, having a family. This has now become much more relevant to them. Whereas previously, someone who's, you know, in their 50s may not have used the service had it only been for like retail, you know, for fashion, because some people may still be more inclined, especially some of those older consumers may still be more inclined going into store and trying on the clothes as opposed to shopping online. But yeah, I think as you see, I think technology and sort of white goods and home appliances is where we've seen the biggest growth over the past 12 months, which in turn has driven that more wider adoption growth among some of the age groups.
Thanks, Luke. Maher here is asking, buy now, pay later is perceived as being cheaper by customers, but is it cheaper than an installment payment plan offered by the banks? And I guess there are two sides to this story: the cost to the end consumer and the cost to the merchant, right? Because merchants...
So ultimately, yeah. So from the consumer perspective, obviously it is cheaper. You know, credit cards will always be that you know, while if you pay off your credit card on time, you won't incur any sort of interest or any sort of cost to that. There is still that sort of perception that, yeah, there's an interest rate on credit cards. Whereas buy now, pay later, there's not. And I think, you know, people feel more secure knowing that there will be no cost incurred by making that purchase. They'll pay the retail price for it, and that's all they'll pay. In terms of the merchants and the retailers who are partnering with these buy now, pay later, obviously they're the ones who are going to be fronting some of the costs for this service to be offered. However, we are seeing that, you know, the way in which buy now, pay later is driving consumers to spend more money or spend it more frequently. So it's increasing the average basket value, as well as, you know, it's lowering that checkout abandonment. So I think when some of these retailers, they are beginning to weigh up the pros and cons of buy now, pay later, and they're seeing that, yeah, the benefits and the extra revenue that it's generating is worth the additional costs that they're having to bear in order to provide that service.
Yep, I agree. And back to the younger consumers, and I think the question we've got here is, how much of it is really the younger consumers' propensity to, or unlike, you know, the fact that they're less likely to want to take a credit card versus them being declined a credit card, or the customer experience that is being provided by the challenges? I guess, to sum it up, how much does each of these factors play a role in the buy now, pay later uptake by younger consumers?
Yeah, so I think addressing the first part around sort of they maybe potentially being declined for a credit card, the way in which I see it, especially among the youngest of those groups, so the ones who are 18, 19, 20, I don't think it's a case of being declined a credit card. I think they're at that sort of age where they wouldn't naturally probably be looking to take out a credit product. As I said, from our research, we see that people are more in that sort of like the early and mid 20s before they start taking up a credit card. The majority of consumers is when they're sort of mid 20s or early 20s. So I think buy now pay later is introducing them to the idea of having some sort of debt, taking out a credit product at a younger age, and I think it is fulfilling their needs. So in turn, in terms of the idea that among those youngest of consumers, that it's not being able to take out a credit card is what's driving them to buy now pay later. I don't think it's the case. And even among some of the older consumers, I say our data is suggesting that it's those who are using buy now pay later already hold a credit card. So it's not a case that it's the ones who aren't credit worthy or those who have been declined for a card is resulting to using buy now pay later as the other option. Is they're using it as an alternative. Some people are using both equally as much.
Thank you, Luke. Back to the regulations and credit checks. I think we've looked at that earlier, but from a consumer perspective and the ease of application being an easy process. But the question here is around the merchants. One of the attendees is asking, don't you think that once the credit checks come in, that the process will be clunky and it might have an impact on how much merchants want to take part in this, assuming that the process from the merchant perspective will become also complex?
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. So one of the ways in which one of the key benefits to partnering with a buy now pay later service from that merchant perspective is that it's increasing or it's lowering that checkout abandonment, and then obviously part of it is around it just being quicker and easier, and that is obviously going to be a key factor to that. And obviously if all of a sudden the application of it becomes more complex and more clunky, then again we may see the opposite happen. We may see that people are beginning to abandon their purchases and abandoning their basket as a result of the application of the journey just being a little bit longer and a bit more complicated. Again, it's still too early, I think, to sort of make a call on that. But yeah, I could see it could possibly pose a bit of a problem, not just for the buy now pay later, but for the retailers who are then offering that as a service.
Thank you, Luke. And carrying on with the theme on the barriers that buy now pay later may have to overcome over the next few months, I think it would be really good to understand how much do consumers know that buy now pay later does not provide protection? Is this something that consumers are aware of? This is obviously a question direct from Ashley here.
So in terms of protection, as I may need a little bit more information around that sort of. If they could maybe respond with a bit more information, a bit more context around what they mean by that sort of idea of protection, we can maybe come back to that question towards the end.
Sure. I think the question is relevant to the fact that, for instance, if you use your Visa card or MasterCard, there's a protection, but we can definitely reach out.
Okay, no, actually that makes sense. Yeah, so it's the idea. Yeah, obviously, if you use your credit card, you're protected, or even if you use debit card, you have the whole chargeback thing. It means that if anything goes wrong, there's someone to lean towards. In all fairness, I don't think so. I think one thing that if I draw upon personal experience, so remember back at the start of the whole COVID pandemic, when we first went into lockdown and all these flights got cancelled and all these holidays got cancelled. So I myself, I had one of my holidays got cancelled as a result of it. And I was talking to some people around getting around sort of the idea of how you can get your money back. And I spoke to a couple of friends around the whole idea of chargeback, basically. And myself, because I work within the financial industry, I'm aware of these sort of things. But generally, no, I don't think people are. I'm not aware of it. I said a lot of my friends weren't aware that there's options available to them. So I think, generally speaking, probably no. I don't think consumers are aware that they're not protected by now, pay later. I'm not sure if they're really even thinking about that. But again, I think it also comes down to then around sort of like the types of retailers who they're using these buy now pay later services with. I think again, a lot of people will be using these services with retailers who they've used in the past, who they trust in the past. So that idea that there will be no problem with that purchase or with that transaction is probably part of the reasons that's what we're thinking about, really.
Thanks, Luke. Luke, we've got loads of questions and I'm going to try and answer those really quickly. So let's go into a firing squad, 30 seconds, so we can see what we can do in the next 33 minutes, sorry. First question here, do you see banks working their way into buy now, pay later offering? Of course they will.
I think so. I think, as I say, the way in which, over time we'll see that their credit card book will start being affected as a result of buy now, pay later, and it'd be difficult for them to say that there's not an opportunity there for them. So yeah, I think so.
And what do you think the bank's response will be like, or should be like, in response to the buy now, pay later?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess it depends on the market. I think here in the UK, I see a lot of typically a lot of people use their debit cards for their day-to-day transaction, day-to-day spending. So maybe I could just see it as being a sort of just there being sort of an option when you're sort of going for that payment method, just being another sort of like box that you can tick to try and either pay later or pay in instalments. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it would be as a separate sort of almost a separate product, or whether it be a separate card relating to that, or it would in some way be incorporated within their current sort of product offering. At this moment,
and there are obviously many
to say.
And there are obviously many examples globally where banks have partnered with have partnerships with buy now pay later providers. So it really doesn't have to be all or nothing. But I think it's really obvious that there is, when it comes to payments, consumers are not shy at going out of their main banking relationships and using a new fintech provider, and that certainly is a threat that is banks are presented with, and if they don't look at it and address it, then they might risk leaking some of the value of those relationships. One of the questions I've got here, Luke, is do we see in our data especially that people have overspent as a result of having access to buy now pay later? And another question here is, how do we see the adoption of buy now pay later in societies where cash is the predominant payment method, so the likes of the UAE, for example?
Yeah. So again, I think the idea that these vulnerable consumers are overspending or putting themselves at risk, I think it's currently a bit overstated. I think it is a concern. I think that's why the FCA is trying to introduce some sort of regulation to it. But I don't think it's not quite the case. I think what we normally would see is among some of the young consumers are the ones who would be more applicable to maybe overspending, not quite understanding how to manage their money. However, in the recent years we've seen this massive also adoption of the whole PFM tools, and there's more young consumers now are using sort of like different apps and banking apps to manage their finances. And I think, compared to maybe a decade ago, I think younger people are a little bit more savvy when it comes to managing their finances. And one of the points that was made in one of the earlier slides looked around different features that they will find appealing with buy now pay later, and that idea of being able to better control your spending and manage your repayments came up quite strongly. So I think, generally speaking, no, I think a lot of people are using this service correctly, and then they are they're not just it's not as the number of people who are possibly vulnerable, I think, is not as high as what some other people would suggest. And I think your second point was around sort of the whole quite cash dominant. So taking like the UAE, for example, yeah, we know that if anything, I think, yeah, there is still a place for buy now, pay later in the UAE market. We know in comparison to the UK, who we typically use our debit cards for our day-to-day transactions. We do see in the UAE, as in addition to cash, you're also used to using and paying for stuff on that credit card. So yeah, so there is a place for that buy now, pay later. I think one of the key things will be in some of these markets is around the rewards. So we know in the UAE, as well as some of the other Middle East countries, rewards are a big thing. It's one of the main drivers for them to be using and making payments on their credit cards. And unless it may be different as well. So whereas UK buy now, pay later service providers have not really looked into the whole rewards scheme just yet, and they may do in the future. I think in some of these other markets where rewards and stuff like that on credit cards is seen as being a more important driver, then I think these buy now, pay later providers are probably already thinking about that, already looking to introduce some sort of rewards or loyalty into their service.
Thanks, Luke. And my final question, there's a question here around the consumers surveyed, the numbers and the locations in this pack that you presented today.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so in terms of the data here, so it's from one of our studies that we've done essentially like a bespoke sort of study that we've done around sort of buy now, pay later. The sample itself is nationally representative. The number of individuals that we spoke to was around 1,000. And again, with in terms of the sort of quotas that we applied to that, it represents the nation in terms of like the age, gender, region, and well as and income as well. So the data that we're showing here does, in our mind, it is reflective of the UK market.
And it is UK based. Thank you.
Yes, it's with UK data.
Thank you very much, Luke. We are running out of time, and I am notorious for extending these beyond the time limit. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, and I just want to thank you so much for the interesting session and also the conversation that we've had, and maybe wrap up. And again, thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and for making this webinar possible, and especially for the Q&A session, because I can assure you, Luke and I are really happy about that. I want to remind you that now you will have an unlimited access to the content of the webinar. We will be in touch in due course with the recording. Apologies if we couldn't answer all of your questions. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. My contact details are on the slide in front of you. If you have any questions, just let me know. And we are really grateful again for you joining the session and look forward to igniting some great conversations in the coming weeks. Luke, thanks again for your time today.
You're welcome.
Goodbye, everyone, and see you on the next webinar.